Hi everybody. Key concept 3.2 focuses on the experiences of everyday life and how it was shaped by industrialization and was varied throughout the continent depending upon class and location. Industrialization promoted the development of new classes in the industrial regions of Europe. And as a result, we're going to see the divisions of labor lead to very new self-conscious classes, namely the proletariat, or working class, and the bourgeoisie, or capitalist businesses. And even within these different classes, we're going to see different divisions as well, which we'll talk about shortly. We're going to continue to see the dominance of agricultural elites in less industrial areas, particularly in Eastern Europe. And with the upper classes, we're going to see an association with philanthropic, political, and social associations. So, for example, uh, those of you who read Germinal, you saw how, the bourgeoisie, the Hennebaus, and the families wanted to give to charity. If you've watched Mary Poppins, the song Feed the Birds is about this obligation, this duty to give to charity that was shared by all of the upper classes. We'll see them more involved politically during this time period, really throughout the century. And using Britain as an example, in prior to 1832, 1 in 100 adult males could vote. The Great Reform Bill of 1832 changed it to 1 in 32 adult males. And it wasn't until the 1880s that we saw universal male suffrage. So we see more political involvement from the upper classes, but also that spreads to the lower classes by the end of the century. As far as working classes, not only did they gain suffrage by the end of the century, but they also gained, in many cases, they joined unions, which helped to improve conditions. They had also mutual aid societies. And even really by the end of the century, once again, that working class that was so suffering in the early part of the centuries will be doing somewhat better with an improved standard of living. The next part of this key concept focuses on Europe's experience with rapid population growth and urbanization, and both the problems and opportunities that this created. So the 19th century saw population growth, longer life expectancy, and lowered infant mortality rates. So an example, the population of Europe increased by about 50% between 1870 and 1914. By 1900, 9 European cities had populations of over 1 million. Significant decline in mortality rates occurred, especially, like I said, amongst children. And it's interesting because this population growth occurred, but birth rates themselves actually fell during the period. Um, and the real reason for this population growth was this longer life expectancy, better medical knowledge, better nutrition, and better housing were key reasons. The number of children per family fell, um, and this was especially more evident in the middle classes, but those that survived increased, and those that lived longer also increased. As far as urbanization, it did lead to both problems and opportunities throughout the 19th century. And Britain was the first large European country to experience urban growth. Over 50% of the population by 1891 lived in urban areas, and London was by far the largest city in Europe. Poor living conditions during the first half of the 19th century were characteristic of these urban areas. Parks and open spaces were almost non-existent. People lived in extremely overcrowded conditions, whether attics or cellars or tenement houses, with often as many as 10 people per room. Open drains and sewers flowed along the streets with garbage and human excrement, and public transportation didn't exist. But with these problems, over time we're going to see changes. There's a great cholera epidemic in London mid-century, and later on we'll see public health movements that are going to grow that's going to try to remedy the problem of high diseases and the mortality rate that occurred in the cities. And but like you said, the population growth grows up by the second part of the century, and part of that is due to more successful public health movements overall. The sanitary idea is by far the most important, and basically clean up the urban environment. Sewage and water systems provided an adequate supply of clean pipe water that could carry off human waste. And, Britain, like I said, because of that cholera epidemic, passed its first public health law by 1848. Germany, France, United States followed. And by the 1860s and 1870s, many European cities had actually made significant progress in public sanitation. Another way in which urbanization began to lead to opportunities by the second part of the century was also in the redesign in public transportation. And the best example of this redesign was the rebuilding of Paris during the reign of Napoleon III. Designed by Baron von Haussmann, Paris changed from a city that had winding roads and, you know, barricades put up, often with revolutions, into wide boulevards. Like I said, it was partially used to prevent these revolutions, these uprisings in France, with the demolition of slums, but the creation of parks, the creation of open spaces. You know, Furthermore, in Paris, a new system of aqueducts doubled the fresh water supply, and 400 miles of underground sewers were built. Once again, in response to cholera epidemics, and other cities followed Paris's lead, Vienna, Cologne, and so forth. Another opportunity that arose in the cities was that of public transportation. By the 1890s, the electric streetcar had revolutionized city transportation. This facilitated the growth of suburbs on the outskirts of cities, and electricity also led to the creation of, city lighting and, street lights, and even the creation of London's subway system, and then the Paris metro. And, as a result, we're going to see, more opportunities. Furthermore, cities promoted better educational as well as cultural opportunities, and a lot of recreational opportunities as well, more leisure time activities, something we will talk about later on. Rural areas often suffered declines in available labor and had weakened communities, and part of that was during this age of industrialization, particularly in the western areas, so many people were leaving the rural areas and going to the west, where there was also a significant group of workers who were simply landless and, had nowhere else to go. And over time, the Industrial Revolution altered the family structure and relations for the bourgeois and working class families. And, we're going to see as one of the things, as far as bourgeois families, a certain diversity within these families as well. First of all, you're going to have probably about 15 to 20% of the population in Western Europe grow into this bourgeois or upper middle class or middle class. Eastern Europe, much less, maybe 2% in Russia, where nobles dominated. But in France and Britain, your gentry, your bourgeoisie, you have your upper middle class, including bankers, industrial leaders, business owners, top government officials. These families tended to employ servants and so forth. You also had a very diversified middle class, smaller businessmen, professionals, merchants, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, that often employed at least one servant as a cook or maid. Once again, I often look at the movie Mary Poppins, and the Banks family would be this example of this diversified middle class, wealthy enough to have a nanny and take care of the children, and, but still the fathers having to work and fulfilling that traditional role that existed for both males and females during that time period in this upper middle class home. There was also the lower middle class, or the petite bourgeoisie, often independent shopkeepers, small merchants, some store managers, teachers, clerks as well. And interesting, this lower middle class, this petite bourgeoisie, actually grew from about 7% of the population in mid-century to about 20% by 1900. Women began to work more as in department store clerks, secretaries, waitresses, nurses, um, and so forth. And overall, we're going to see, as far as the middle class goes, this bourgeoisie, several characteristics. Often, many of them believe strongly in classical liberalism. They sought protection of property. They had constitutional assemblies. For example, the British Parliament, the French Parliament, Chamber of Deputies. They emphasized individual liberty and respectability, often based on economic success. And the families, was the foundation of this new social order. Education was important, religion was important, and, we're going to see strong feelings of nationalism amongst this part of the population. But we're also going to see improved conditions for the working class over time. The working class, which was about 80% of the population, many were peasants and hired hands, especially in rural areas in Eastern Europe. But we are going to see in the cities, these highly skilled workers at the top of the working class, about 15% of its population, construction bosses, foremen, highly skilled laborers, and then semi-skilled laborers as well. Unskilled laborers, um, domestic servants, mostly women, were at the bottom. And, there are also children that worked as well. Older children comprised about 14% of workers in British textile factories in 1874. But even with these conditions, they will improve. We'll see, labor laws to protect them, particularly in Britain. The 10 Hours Act allowed for schooling in Britain, required some type of schooling. The Mines Act kept women and children from going underground. And then also by the end of the century, the use of social welfare programs, which interestingly, the most extensive was in Bismarck's Germany. And part of the reason for Bismarck's creating old age insurance, disability insurance, unemployment insurance, was the fact that these were appealing to the Social Democrats. And Bismarck adapted these policies to appeal to the masses to keep their support. More romantic love became, a more important reason for marriage, and companionate marriage became the ideal. And part of this was due to the rising standard of living. People could marry at a younger age, as well. And fidelity in marriage was also particularly emphasized during this period, especially in the middle class. As far as the working class, we are going to see a high rate of illegitimacy in the early part of the century, but once again, that will decrease after 1850. And, there was still a high rate of premarital sex that remained, but more couples married if the woman became pregnant. Prostitution amongst middle and upper class continued, and the middle and upper class, comprised most of the customers as they tended to marry late. And as far as leisure time activities during this time period, we're going to see more and more activities that people can do. For example, the growth of the theater, the parks, beaches, opera houses. And, this was due to the fact that people gradually enjoyed higher wages while the price of food declined, particularly in the second part of the century. In Britain, wages almost doubled between 1850 and 1900, which gave more money to be spent on clothing. Meat consumption increased significantly. Part of that was due to the refrigerated railroad car, due to ice boxes, and by the end of the 19th century, Europeans will consume more meat than they had consumed since the time of the plague, since the 14th century. As a result of the Second Industrial Revolution, heightened consumerism developed across particularly Western Europe. Industrialization, mass marketing increased production and demand. This included clothing, processed foods, labor-saving devices. And better transportation and other innovations created new industries and increased consumerism, which led to an overall better quality of life. Some examples of this heightened consumerism included sports, as sports clubs grew significantly and they attracted both spectators and participants. Soccer, rugby, track and field were amongst many that grew during this time period, and a huge bicycle craze swept across Western Europe during the 1890s, which included increased numbers of women who were also getting involved in other sports. Interestingly, this emerging sports culture is also going to mirror the growth of aggressive nationalism that is occurring during the late 19th century. And some social Darwinists believe that sports competition confirmed the superiority of certain groups. The Olympics actually returned in 1896. In addition to sports, cafes and taverns enjoyed increased patronage in cities and towns, and department stores are going to grow significantly and were frequented by the middle classes. Catalogs enjoyed popularity, and people could buy many things through that. And in Paris, dance halls, concerts, plays drew thousands of people each week. But because of the persistence of primitive agricultural practices and landowning patterns, some areas of Europe still lagged in industrialization while facing famine, debt, and land shortages. And probably the most important example of this in Western Europe would be the Irish potato famine. Occurring in the 1840s, the Irish had grown to rely exclusively upon the potato. And by the blight had hit the potato crop during the 1840s, most of the Irish worked the land owned by absentee English landowners, and as they could no longer pay their rent and could no longer eat, we're going to see over 1 million Irish die of starvation. Another, I think, 2 million are going to actually emigrate, many to the United States and many to Britain. And it's one of the reasons that there are more Irish in the United States today than there are still in Ireland. We're also going to see Russian serfdom, and we will see the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, which we will talk about in a later review. And that's it for now. Our next review is going to focus on key concept 3.3, responses to the industrialization, and the development of what we call the isms.